Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm very happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me back.
We're here in the studio at UT, and when we were last here, we took last week off because we sort of decided to take weeks off now and again. But when we were last here just a couple of weeks ago, the politics and border security and the COVID pandemic kind of briefly harmonizing in Texas was our topic with, Governor Abbott's synchronized renewal of disaster declarations in both areas. The plot has only thickened since then, shall we say.
That's for sure.
I think we're maybe a little ahead of the curve.
Well, I love your use of the word harmonized.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for him, I think it kind of was, at least at the moment.
Briefly.
In terms of the release of those two renewals and the fact that nobody really picked it up. And, I talked to a couple of reporters about that since then, and they were like, well, he kind of has to regularly do this, and so it's not really news, was kind of the implication. I think news is not just the thing itself, but in the context.
Yeah,
but
we could. I mean, I have a response to that, but I think I'll save it for later in a different area.
I think I'll bet we'll be able to come back.
We'll put a pin in that one.
The Put a Pin in It podcast. Right. So since then, there's been just to follow up on a decidedly less synchronized, collision of the two issues of COVID and border security in Washington, last week and, sort of in the last 10 days or so. I mean, at the national level, it was very interesting because to me anyway, on the following up on what happened in Texas with these two quietly laid out disaster declarations.
Quiet disasters.
Oh, it's the quiet disaster, like the quiet storm.
Yeah.
Two things happened in Washington centered in the Democratic Congress and the Biden White House. First was the announcement that the CDC plans to end the Title 42 COVID-19 immigration policy that required asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their cases were being adjudicated. And, CDC made what, they said was a pandemic, public health driven decision to end this policy because of the winding down of the pandemic. Now, probably, and that was on the, and so that's on the calendar now for May 25th, but coincides with the upsurge, the upsurge in migration that we expect seasonally this time of year. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of surface distancing from the White House on that seems, I guess, plausible.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, I think this is where the criticism is being laid so much among, at the Biden administration and Democrat. I mean, there's less surface level sort of, criticism coming from Texas now, directly.
Right.
But this has been the issue is that, it's kind of hard to, circle the square, as we like to say sometimes here, right? Where kind of figuring out exactly what the policy dynamic and the political dynamic and whether the two are even intersecting really, honestly, as much as they probably should normatively here in a way they're not. I mean, there's part of me looks at this and just says, if we just take a step back for a second, say, okay, so pandemic era restrictions that basically close our borders to asylum seekers, regardless of seasonal flows of migration, because they're going to happen no matter what. So we're supposed to keep those in place forever?
Right.
I mean, so there is a question here as we're winding down from the pandemic that we do have to rescind these, these sort of pandemic era rules. And the point is kind of becoming clear. It's well, which rules? And it kind of depends on who you ask. And here, there's one side that says this is a clear political opportunity because of seasonal migration. And now because of, basically what is a winding down of pandemic era rules, you're creating a political crisis that can be exploited.
Right.
But the fact is, it's so clearly visible that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Which makes people kind of question who is at the wheel here, right?
And in terms of the sheer politics of it, this is a policy that was associated with Donald Trump. And in which, I think the general sense when this was put in place was that there was a rationale for it, in terms of public health, but that, Democrats felt like the Trump administration doing this was in bad faith.
Well, yeah, and people have been writing for months about the fact that they feel that, at least in sort of Democratic activist circles, that the Biden administration has not moved fast enough to rescind a lot of these Trump era policies.
Whereas on the other hand, if you're one of the handful of moderate Democrats, or put it this way, Democrats elected from moderate districts, and there are several of those.
And I would say, or even, or setting aside ideology, in Texas, Democrats elected to border districts.
Right. So there were a couple of different groups of, several different groups of Democrats that, kind of said maybe this isn't the time to do this. And the middle ground that emerged in suggestions from some of them was, no, we definitely have to undo this, sort of acknowledging the humanitarian piece of this, but also saying perhaps we should wait. And there is, and they had at least a little bit of the cover of the spread of yet another variant that is spreading, a little more prominent in the Northeast as we're recording this. Certainly, a whole other topic, a real, issue in China right now and in parts of Europe, et cetera.
Right.
But, I termed it a collision, not just because of the collision on that, but also that as the CDC announced this, a deal had been cut after a lot of back and forth on a $10 billion COVID relief bill that the Biden administration had been working very hard to pass. I think the original allocation was closer to $15 billion. They, pared it down to $10 billion. It was a bipartisan deal. Mitt Romney had helped, had been one of the brokers, to set the stage. It passed the House, was about to go to the Senate. And as soon as this was announced, Romney released a letter saying, yeah, we're going to have to talk about this some more. That's now on the shelf.
Right.
Now, and this also plays into another, and this is where you get, to my mind, a kind of a collision and a tension here. And that on one hand, the policy pronouncement is CDC saying, we are, it's time to end this policy for all the reasons we've talked about. On the other hand, the Biden administration is going to Congress and saying, we need billions of dollars because we're out of the previous money and we need to move on to the next stage of fighting the pandemic. So that's very easy. I mean, look, from a even reasonable, I don't think you have to be a policy sophisticate to see that the two things are not necessarily inconsistent, that much of the pandemic money was to work on next level vaccines. It's, things that weren't necessarily emergency response like we've seen a year ago, where we're going out and buying masks and, this kind of thing. But the surface level it's easier if you're hostile to the Biden administration to look at this and kind of go, like, what are you guys doing here?
Yeah, the thing is, and this dovetails with the conversation last week, where it's really sort of, odd and sort of having followed the local politics to the statewide politics of the COVID response for the last number of years, and then to see Abbott again sort of quietly renew the disaster declaration, necessary or not, but acknowledging the fact that we're still in a pandemic,
right? But
at the same time, sort of having downplayed it for the better part of the last couple of years. So, this is, it's funny. It's sort of, it's sort of a who wore it better. They're both kind of sitting here kind of dealing with, similar but dynamics, but from different, different sides.
Right. And I want to underline that I think that, there's a grown up way to look at where we are in the pandemic that acknowledges the facts on the ground, that can say we still have a pandemic situation, but the parameters of the situation are different now than they were a year ago. In a significant way.
But there's also an election in 7 months.
And then there's this whole thing about that little election. So, which brings us to the way that, to my mind, these fans have been flamed, in Texas in the last week. So Governor Abbott, jumped in the reaction to what the Biden administration was talking about in terms of ending the Remain in Mexico program.
Policy, yeah.
At the top, at the most general level, was among the many who criticized it in general.
Yep, sure.
Opposition
party, that's what we expect.
But this was an area where, we've talked at various times about Greg Abbott navigating the space between making sure that he is not leaving too much space to his right, and yet being fairly calculating and all this talk about sometimes his judicial temperament. Well, I think this was more the former than the latter in this circumstance, although, one can make, because he announced some new measures and announced them with some pretty raw, red meat rhetoric, I would say.
It was
Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I would say so, right? I mean, so what are the, let's just get into those decisions.
What did they announce? Yeah, what did they do?
So the first was, sort of very clear, we're gonna bus these migrants to D.C., right? And then later we found, I remember we were talking about that, and I said to you, I don't know if you can just like put someone on a bus and like just send them to another state. I'm pretty sure,
maybe not legal.
Maybe not legal. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer, though, but turns out, very quickly, it's like, these are voluntary trips.
Right.
So obviously we're not forcing, basically busloads of migrants to D.C. And then there's this policy of increased inspection of Mexican trucks crossing the border. Obviously, the federal government already inspects every truck that comes across the U.S.-Mexico border. They do it with a lot of technology. They do it pretty comprehensively, as I understand it. The Texas policy is a little bit different because Texas can't actually go and start opening up trailers. So what they do is they do mechanical checks, which is what they're already allowed to do.
Right. In the same way that you can't just throw people on buses, you can't just stop trucks and
just start doing what you want.
Open them up without some semblance of probable cause.
Right. So this isn't so even though the policy's ostensibly been, basically proposed as, look, we need to stop all the drugs and all of the people who are being pulled in through these commercial trucks. The reality is that once they get through the federal check, really all they can do is kind of, make sure that the trucks actually are compliant with Texas roads.
Right.
So
so there's safety checks.
And they've gone there's safety checks, and they used to be basically random, more or less, it sounds like, and now they're being comprehensive. And so, what people are saying from what I've read is, trips that used to take, could take 30 minutes are now, you have truck drivers who are sitting there for, 3, 6, 12, 20 hours. And
some number of them also then being sidelined completely if they don't pass the safety check and need to remedy
and
this.
So that's led to a reaction. I don't know if you would call it is it a trucker protest? Well, I don't know. Anyway, this is confusing. Yes. Truck driver protest on the southern border.
It's going to be a dissertation or at least a master's thesis somewhere on trucker activism.
Yes.
Post-globalization and the trucker activism, modes of protest in the...
right. So drivers on the other side of the border are now basically protesting, which is stalling traffic going back out of Texas.
And that's focused, in far Reynosa.
Yeah, and so if people don't know, just as an aside, like a ton of the overland trade in the U.S., a huge percentage. And last time, I don't want to say a percentage because I kind of have one in my head from the last time I looked, but it's still kind of guessing. But it's the majority of overland kind of trucking trade is coming through Texas. It's coming through these borders. Like, this is a big thing. So obviously, this is, resulted in slowdowns, pushback on the Mexican side, and, it kind of aggravates supply chain issues so much so that, even some Republicans, notably Sid Miller, of all people, is coming out to say, hey, maybe this isn't a good policy.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, of the candidates, if you were to come to me and say, hey, name me 3 or 4 people that you think will, make a statement on this, the ag commissioner probably would have been on the list. So
number one, that's true about anything, right? Number one. And number two, it's not the fact that he's making a statement. It's the acknowledgement that, the sort of sane kind of response to this is coming from Sid Miller.
Right.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Okay. So what, there's so many things about this that are interesting, I think, to us in the way that we think about this, right?
Look, the most obvious reading, I heard there was a story on NPR this morning. I'm not sure if it was produced I think it was produced in Texas by one of the Texas stations. I only caught the end of it, so I was getting ready. But had a guest, sort of a soundbite from somebody saying, somebody opposed to the policy, no doubt.
Yeah.
Saying, look, this is about the politics, and, beginning, end.
Yeah.
Now I think that's probably a little reductive, but the politics are a necessary but not sufficient part of this explanation, perhaps.
Here's the thing for me. Like, I find myself basically agreeing with that because the policy itself is so distant and unrelated to the actual problem that's supposedly spurring the policy.
Right.
Like, if we were looking for, migrants being, again, ferried across inside truck trailers, well, we're not actually doing that, right?
Right.
Ultimately, if this is about drugs and all that other stuff, isn't that what Operation Lone Star is supposed to be about? Yeah. And we know about the reporting of that and kind of how loose they've been with sort of their success in terms of this. So maybe it's related to that. But ultimately, is any of this related to the CDC's lifting of, rules that relate to to basically asylum seekers?
Yeah, I
mean, it has nothing to do with that.
To put this more directly, I would say, is this a policy solution to the policy problem,
which is the Title 42
that supposedly
revocation.
Instigated this? And the answer to that has to be, I think, yes.
Yeah, no. No. And so that's, it's fine. It is what it is. But, we're all adults here, right? We study politics. But to pretend it's anything else is kind of like, okay, I just can't start from that proposition.
Right. I mean, well, this is where, we don't have to do it again per se. This is where we, though, as I kind of, to quote myself.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm trying to think about how I'm going to not quote myself.
Right. I mean, I was on a panel last week at the Lone Star Legislative Summit in Nacogdoches, which was great and a very fun experience. A lot of great people in Nacogdoches and a lot of political folks and a lot of legislators. Very good event and enjoyed myself. But in which, we kind of came around to this in a panel discussion I was on. I just said, look, at some point, you have to just acknowledge that immigration and border security are kind of the Rosetta Stone of Republican politics. Mm-hmm. If you need to figure out, when you look at some high visibility measure or any policy measure related to the border, you can map it into the Republican coalition, and in particular, its ability to bind people and bring people together and get the kind of reaction. We've talked about the polling data on here a million times. I mean, the fact that, simply put, most Republicans, are liable to tell pollsters that they think either immigration or border security the most important problem facing the state.
Yeah, 50 to 70% of Republicans, almost every poll we conduct.
So it's very salient, and there's a lot of consensus on the direction and the substance of the opinions that fall out of that attribution of it as a problem. Republicans favor, strong enforcement, restrictive immigration policies, et cetera.
At least 2/3 to 3/4 on pretty much anything.
Right. We have to get that out there just as the groundwork here for anybody that,
Yeah. So
maybe you're a new listener or something.
Right. So groundwork laid. So I think something else that, I've said before, probably on this podcast, is that, when I expected at this point in time is a version of what we've seen. And what I mean by that is, Abbott ran pretty far to his right, throughout much of the primary season to fend off his challengers. And then the question becomes, okay, we've talked about how far is too far. We've talked about, this idea of what would a pivot look like?
Right.
And I've said before, I think the pivot for Abbott is going to be back to the border, not to the middle, but to focusing on this issue. And we've written,
I actually wrote about this last week. There's actually a week before last. There's actually a piece on the website that kind of lays out some of the logic with some of this data on why immigration and border security represent not only a good move for Republicans seeking to shape the general election agenda, but also make the point you were just making that, the pivot is not necessarily on the left-right spectrum. It's where the emphasis falls in terms of the issue agenda that you're trying to put in front of the electorate.
Right, and that's valuable for Republicans for at least two reasons. One, look, if the election is about securing the border, no Democrat is winning. I mean, just play that thought experiment out however you want. It doesn't matter, right? And so that's sort of where we start. So then the thing about last week, I would say, or this sort of what's happened here, this sort of, I think this might be an overreach.
Well, to make let's make the A case first.
I jumped ahead.
So just it's okay. Just the other two pieces of that make this. Seemingly a positive strategic move. Or one, obviously, the general midterm election environment that we're in right now. Right. There's a Democrat in the White House. Border and immigration policy right now are owned by the Democrats.
And it's the thing that Biden is rated the worst on among all the issues we tested.
Yeah, Biden is not getting good ratings on that from Texans or from Americans, but especially from Texans.
And there's no small share of Democrats who think he's doing a bad job on this issue too.
And it's a good issue with independents, et cetera. So being able to hang this on the Biden administration is a good piece of this. And because the border issue attracts national press, whatever you think of Greg Abbott's long-term ambitions or whether that, makes sense or not, this does get, Governor Abbott and Texas Republicans in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the national press as a response to the Biden administration and highlights this as a problem. I think it was in Axios and Politico
and two things,
this morning,
and,
et cetera.
Not to go down that road for any longer than we have to, it also distinguishes him from Ron DeSantis.
Right.
Ron DeSantis can't do anything like what Greg Abbott can do on the border because he doesn't have a border like that with Mexico. So it's just different, it's a way to differentiate, And
so obviously we're talking about, but also we haven't said it, but we have to say it explicitly. So, it raises this notion of Greg Abbott having national political ambitions, whether it's running for president or being a national political figure. Yeah. Subject for another podcast,
right?
And one that's not going to be resolved in the near term. Anyway.
But I would also say, even if you set that aside, he's also following a very, very long-held playbook of positioning himself, as others have in the same position, as fighting back against the federal government's failure, at least when Democrats are in control.
Right. Well, and one of the interesting things about this, I think, historically, and this is I will not digress too far here, I swear, but if you go back over the last 20 years, this even emerges periodically as position taking by Texas governors in response to other streams in the party.
Yeah.
One of the first real public breaks, and, people in, the game knew that there was not a lot of love lost between Team Perry and Team George W. Bush in the late 90s and early 2000s over various issues. But one of the first times that Rick Perry really kind of publicly crossed the Republican president at the time, former Texas Governor George W. Bush, was over these issues.
Right.
So, it's also got this subtle element of, sometimes the Texas federal government friction. I think you're right. It's most pronounced, as we've seen in the last 15 years, between Democratic and Republicans in Texas and Democrats in Washington, D.C., but it can also sometimes be a way of positioning yourselves internally in the Republican Party.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's definitely...
So, so that's also a thing, and in some ways, some of it is just, it kind of goes back to the DeSantis point a tiny bit, although that's more about who has the opportunity to do what. DeSantis just doesn't have any border with Mexico, which I'm sure he's
lamenting.
He might invade Louisiana from the Panhandle to try to...
Well, he wants to free he wants to free the Cajun folk who really see
right.
themselves as Floridians.
Yes, right, exactly. And then kind of get into East Texas. And once you're in Louisiana, East Texas.
Well,
it's like
the whole Gulf should be yours.
Right, and this is there's a funny thing about how Perry had to dial back the busing thing quickly, because one of the things, or that Abbott had to dial back the busing thing, because one of the things that was in the ether was there were people going, well, isn't that what Putin is doing with Ukrainians and Russians, making them get on buses and go to Russia? I actually heard that. So
yeah, well, I brought up the issue of the fact that there is some optics about the idea of like, oh, so you're giving free rides to undocumented immigrants to get out of Texas.
Yeah, the fallback position, and I would say that after the initial rush of attention to this, it's kind of gone away in the last 5-6 days. It was a quick hit
at a more meta level and an explicit transition. When you're talking about kind of thinking back over the 20 years and kind of the Perry-Bush dynamics, and then kind of, the one thing that sort of strikes me, and this is true about politics generally, is how short people's memories are.
Yeah.
And this is just important because I think, if you're someone who listens to this podcast, you probably are like, well, let me tell you about what Ann Richard, and right. And and now these people are saying this, but Ann Richard's like, no one cares. And I love and I want the detail. You can have coffee with me. You can tell me all about it. And I'm interested. But when it comes to thinking about voters, it's what happened within the last 6 to 18 months.
Right. And it better be something that happened that was big.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing. We've seen, and there's some polling out right now that, and we don't do this because I think it's a stupid question. I'm not going to point fingers at anybody, but to try to figure out, how do we assess blame here? Who should we blame for, inflation? And it's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Congress, and it's or the news media. And it's yeah, this is stupid. Of course,
or the Russians.
And it's well, yeah, of course you're going to say Joe Biden. He's the president. It's a stupid question, And so, anyway, but I actually think the question that becomes so Abbott's pivoted to the middle, but it raises this kind of this broader issue about we're living in something right now. And the question is, if you say it right now, you go to norm, just sort of your average kind of voter right now, and you say, hey, what's a bigger issue right now, inflation or immigration? Inflation is going to win. I think, for most people, if you put it in a head-to-head. Now, I'm not saying it's not, you see it at the national level, but here's the thing. But here's I know you're shaking your head now. Let me just say.
Well, I'm pondering.
Ponder it, but here's the thing I would say. But part of that is because of something that I think is kind of interesting about this environment, right? Which is that, going back to the thing, Joe Biden's been in office for less than 2 years, and somehow he's responsible for all of the immigrants at the border and all of the inflation that we're experiencing in his, 14 months in office. Fine. I don't care. As I said, politics is politics. Greg Abbott has been in office since 2014 and apparently bears no responsibility for any of Texas's sort of lackluster recovery from the pandemic. I think that's great for Greg Abbott, but then the question becomes, why would I engage in a policy that could directly contribute to inflation and the economic issue in search of an ineffective policy to show that I'm still as tough as I said I was on the border, which, again, no one's trying to compete with you on the border at this point. So to me, what I think, earlier in the pandemic, you brought up the disaster declarations, and Abbott at various points has played with this idea of can we mix this immigration and border security and COVID issue as sort of one thing, which has always been curious because it's COVID's not a big deal if it's in Amarillo, but it is a big deal if it's coming from across the border. And he's been playing with that idea and stuff. But now you're bringing inflation into this area of immigration and border security. And so I think, if someone goes and reads the agenda piece we read, and we talked about, so what's Abbott trying to do, right? He's talking.
Set aside some time.
Set aside some time. You might want to think about a couple of sittings.
# long read.
Yeah, it's a long read. But if you look at, what we talk about from, the O'Rourke campaign, the strategy for the O'Rourke campaign is to try to make the election a referendum on Abbott. Focus has been on the winter storm. It's been on the COVID response. But ultimately, right now, all polling is really negative. National polling is really negative. State level polling is really negative. People are unhappy with the direction of state. They're unhappy with the direction of the country. Right. They're negative ratings of the economy. They have negative ratings of their own personal economic situations. And to the extent that, Abbott's basically taking this sort of, quixotic border security, thing and moving it into a point where you can say, is this actually making the economic situation worse? It seems to me that's a pretty silly risk to take. So what do you think about that, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm probably about 75% there with you, but in this case, this might be about not finding the Venn diagram, but getting the cable all the way to the house. Well, I'm not sure. And what I mean by that is,
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is sort of short-sighted and a little riskier than we're used to seeing Greg Abbott be, perhaps, in that sense, right? Because I don't disagree with the fact that, particularly the part of the argument that, I have no doubt that in the next poll we do, which will be pretty soon, we will see the economy competing pretty strongly with people, in people's estimation of the most important problem certainly facing the country. But I guess the question is, I mean, as you were laying that argument out, I was kind of thinking, well, I guess we'll see. Now, it's not the same one-to-one trade-off setup that you have. But I mean, the most important problem response will be a slight heat check on that argument. But I guess the other thing that I would say would actually go back to what you were saying a minute ago, which is, using my words against me. I think people do have pretty oversimplified understandings of things like inflation, right? And so I probably judge the risk here a little bit lower than you're suggesting, although you didn't. In terms of this going south on Abbott, just because I think that, as a political science, I think it was attributed to Brendan. This was attributed to Brendan Nyan on Twitter. But I do think that your average voter does have what he has called, or is attributed to him, the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, in which, the president is expected to have magic powers to solve every problem. And therefore, any problem that comes up, other political entrepreneurs can readily, blame them for that problem. So, to the extent that this goes south and look, John Moritz had a story, carried on the wires this morning or late yesterday that, the O'Rourke campaign, not surprisingly, is integrating this.
Yeah.
O'Rourke had a big event yesterday talking about economic damage, trying to, make the argument that you're making. But it goes back to a broader problem we've talked about. I mean, you have to be able to, actually it's a problem that we've talked about a lot and that I don't have a clear kind of sense for, which is, how do you balance two things, right? On one hand, this powerful tendency for people to look at these, a big macroeconomic problem like inflation, have enough of an understanding to see what the inputs are and to realize that this is multi-causal and that you shouldn't just go, whose fault this is, or, I shouldn't say you shouldn't. It's useless to say that, but you're not. It's a faulty explanation to go, you know what? The president caused this inflation. Yeah. The president could fix this and he's not.
Yeah.
To saying, well, Greg Abbott is making it worse by, doing this, by imposing these inspections. But the other, but the one more other piece I would add to that is also, well, let's stick with that. I am going to add the other piece just because it's, it's almost residual. But there is I think, probably little understood, but I suspect very present feeling out there about, because there's a history of this as a policy issue in Texas, about Mexican trucks. We're not just talking trucks, which a lot of your average highway drivers don't like anyway. And speaking of complex policy problems, I don't know how many times you've been on the freeway and maybe even yourself and gone, oh, these effing trucks. People don't go, oh, that's trucks. He's trying to get like goods and he's trying to get products so that I can get them.
I should say my wife was raised by a truck driver, so we don't say that.
So you might have a different, but see,
we have a different view.
But not just any truck.
Yeah, a
Mexican truck.
Well, let me just throw this out there. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but what I would say is that what started for O'Rourke is a very difficult sell, right? Trying to link Abbott. Link people's dissatisfaction with the state towards Abbott's stewardship of the state broadly, because look, if it's going to rely on the winter storm, you're out of luck. I mean, that's receding in people's memories, barring some sort of other event, that's not really going to activate people because it's just too far away at this point, right? But the issue of inflation is ever present for everybody. It affects everything. It's affecting jobs. It's affecting housing. It's affecting, kitchen table issues. And you see the cost of gasoline, the cost of groceries are the things that are driving most. And this affects people on a weekly basis. Now, it's one thing when you say, well, Operation Lone Star, we've got all these people. Well, you can say, well, yeah, but we do think the border needs to be secure. And if this is what the cost is, so be it, right? Yeah. But now, and I'm sure economists are already doing this, very quickly, but it's well, how much a day does it cost to inspect every single truck? How much GDP? I mean, basically, whatever, if I'm, the O'Rourke came, it's what is the largest number from among the things? Is it GDP? Is it whatever? Is it lost gross? But now you can say, look, Abbott's not addressing something seriously. He's not focused on the thing that people in the state are focused on, which are the things that you'd imagine most people are focused on. They're focused on, housing, good jobs, being able to get to and from those things, basic state infrastructure.
Dare we call them kitchen table issues?
We might call them kitchen table issues. You see, but instead, Abbott is mobilizing state resources to the tune of fill in the blank dollars per day, right? And the thing, and I was just you're creating the bridge.
And I can't get any lettuce, or I work at a Toyota factory and I can't go to work because there's no parts.
Right, all because, he wants to get reelected and he thinks this is going to help. I mean, to me, you are creating the bridge there that honestly the O'Rourke campaign really needs. And the thing is, I think the damage is already done because what happens? Either they keep doing this and the costs keep adding up and it just becomes a big, big mess. And he's going to eventually, I would say, honestly, look like a fool because of the cost of all this. Or the flip side is the policy gets rescinded at some point, but then you say, okay, for a 7-day political stunt or for a 10-day or a 2-week, the cost to the state of Texas was X billion dollars, right? I mean, look, and again, you still have to land it, you still have to deliver all that.
Yeah.
But the point is, I think where there wasn't a bridge before to make this point, now you can basically take the bridge of look, the extremism on these particular policy areas is actually affecting kitchen table issues. It's one thing for people to kind of passively say, yeah, I more or less agree with this or whatever. But I think when you start to actually hit people in the place where they actually do have serious concerns, I think that kind of throws a wrench into this. And I do think it creates a bridge for O'Rourke, whether he can use it, whether he can mobilize it, all these things, who knows. But I'm skeptical that this is I think it's a bad policy idea, but from a political standpoint, I'm very skeptical.
I think that's fair. I think, I think we've said many times, and most everybody is saying this now because it's kind of obvious, that for Beto O'Rourke to, have a shot at actually winning this or even getting close, but certainly at winning this, something in the fundamentals have got to change.
Right.
So, I think it's fair to say, at one point removed, the something could be, the rise of inflation and the general, and we should also note, overall right now, the general economy is actually in pretty good shape. Inflation is a big problem.
Can I say something about that real quick? I think we're also at a point, maybe in sort of the measurement of public opinion and people's, you were talking about people's simple views towards the economy. We could spend a lot of time just talking about that.
Yeah.
But I want to say, I think we're kind of at a point now where we should just expect about half the population is always going to be dissatisfied with the economy.
Yeah, right.
And so even this idea of what is a measure of the economy that's valid at this point? Well, it's I think it matters a lot more at the margins than in the main.
That's why I think, it'll be interesting to see what we get.
I think it's going to be interesting to see what happened with independence,
right,
in the wake of all this.
So, just to finish that thought, I think I agree. Look, it would be malpractice for the O'Rourke campaign to not see this as a possible opportunity. So maybe we're just, our difference in interpretation here may just be one in magnitude, or, do I think they might unnecessarily be giving the O'Rourke campaign, a possible opening? Yeah, probably. If we really, do the trade-offs, I think it's a little too early to tell. As you were, sort of implying, we'll see how long they do this for. The Abbott campaign has also been pretty good about doing stuff and then just moving on and quietly, and this is a sign of any good, anybody in a position of governance with some political sense knows how to quietly ramp down something, and I think they are pretty good at that. And move on to the next thing and be confident that, we're just going to keep moving on to the next thing. And in that sense, I think this is a little bit actually consistent.
Yeah, I can say it.
Maybe a little bit riskier.
A little rope-a-dope, maybe?
A little riskier. Well, I just think it's consistent with, what we were suggesting in the piece we wrote a couple weeks ago, which is, to the extent with a bunch of caveats that one part of campaign strategy is to keep the policy agenda that is central to the campaign and to your messaging in areas that favor you and don't favor, there's an intersection here between, depending on how it shakes out, that there's a little bit of advantage for both campaigns, which is kind of what you're suggesting, I think. I guess I'm just... I'm pretty confident in the Abbott campaign's ability to continue rotating on to the next thing, while the O'Rourke campaign is understandably trying to get some traction with this and trying to upset the dynamic. I'm just not very confident this is quite enough to do that.
I'll be quick. There's a risk to both, right? And the risk is for Abbott that by bringing economic anxiety into the the way that he's prosecuted, or seems to be executing his, sort of border strategy, it risks muddling the message in a way that could be disadvantageous to him, but it will require the O'Rourke campaign's ability to get into the immigration area and then reinforce the fact that, this is actually what you should be looking at. The problem, of course, is if you're O'Rourke, you have to get into the immigration area. And as you saw, this is already difficult. What did he do today or yesterday? He quickly, distanced himself further from Biden, distanced himself further from the Title 42 revocation. Right. And we know, and that's the other thing too, we know that, we already said it, but, Biden's numbers in Texas on immigration are poor. Yeah. And so ultimately, that's the risk for, I think O'Rourke here, and obviously the reward for Abbott. Having said all that, right, and you think okay, let's say it's just a coin flip as to who wins on this, on the shaping of this. Doesn't mean they win the election, but on the shaping of this, I think by default, safe to assume Abbott is going to, because of, the fact that he has a lot of resources and a lot of success and, a state that has backed kind of his approach. So it would be a sea change to see something else, which I think is why it is reasonable to assume that it won't affect him. But
I think another way of, sort of putting all that is, what the one thing that would help the O'Rourke campaign was to be able to, in this battle for public attention and agenda setting in the campaign, you know, is there something that would give the O'Rourke campaign the initiative and not make them reactive? Right. I just don't think this is it. Right? I mean, it could be, but I'll be surprised if it is.
Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, the thing that comes to my head is, we'll see what happens when the Supreme Court rules on the Mississippi case.
Right, but that would be a different thing,
That'd
right?
Be a very different thing.
That's not this.
No, that's not this.
Okay. I think we have decomposed this to the nth degree. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Good luck with your presentation this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
And thanks to our excellent production crew here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio, in particular the Crack audio team here. I'm Jim Henson, and the material that we've referred to here, in particular the article on agenda setting, which we've been flogging, you'll find at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Have a good rest of the week, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.